Should the local church in America still be sending missionaries to the ends of the earth? In many cases, sending $50 to $100 each month will provide support for one full-time national worker, while to send an American missionary family overseas is over $60,000 a year. The same cost as supporting 60 or more national workers. Admittedly, this rationale is appealing. Nationals have the language, and they know the culture, and they cost so much less. But what about the thousands of people groups around the world where there are no national believers, no witnessing churches? This is the question that we will address in this episode of The Mission Table.
The Mission Table is brought to you by 1615. 1615 exists to help local churches discover and use their unique gifts in partnership with others to make Christ known among all the nations. Through personal, hands-on coaching, we help churches take a more active role in fulfilling the Great Commission. Find out more at 1615.org.
Watch, reason, and participate. Join us on this episode of The Mission Table. To send or not to send? This is The Mission Table, and we are having conversations today about ideas or assumptions that shape missions actions. I'm Matthew Ellison with 1615, and I have some special friends and guests at the table today. Denny Spitters, the Vice President of Church Partnerships with Pioneers, and Dave Hansen, the Vice President of Ministry Relations, kind of equivalent parts in different organizations.
Yep.
So gentlemen, there's been a big push in the last several decades about supporting Native missionaries. And the mantra is, look, we can accomplish so much more with Native missionaries than by sending traditional foreign missionaries. We can actually support probably, 30 or 40 missionaries, Native type, for what it would cost to send one family or something like that. So. Right. And you hear a lot about this is the best bang for your missions buck.
ROI.
Right? Return on investment. So Native missionaries are more effective than foreign missionaries. What do you say?
Well, I think the first thing is, what part of the world are we talking about? Generally, when we're talking about that, we're talking about parts of the world non-European or Western, because you could not have a national doing missionary work in Italy, as an example, and say that it costs that much less than sending a North American missionary to reach an Italian with the gospel of Jesus Christ, or reach some other European country. So a lot of times I think part of the mistake is, what are we talking about? Are we only talking about, so to speak, the Asian world, and particularly India or Sri Lanka or Nepal and that part of the world, where the realities are that a individual living in that country can live on $100 a day versus what a Westerner would take to live in that country. So
you mean $100 a week?
$100 a week. There you go. Sorry.
Or a month. Or months.
That's right. That's
exactly.
Right. So I mean, we got to kind of compare apples to apples when we start talking about this reality.
Yeah, it's kind of an oversimplified way of thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, is it true? I'd say it's not a question of either or. It's a question of both and.
Right.
Yes.
Healthy contextualization, healthy missiology will include indigenous people from the start, and that's what we're seeking to really doing if we're going to bring the gospel into a different culture that has very little to no access. So, the whole idea that, well, it's going to be cheaper, and that's the only reason for this, and we would look at it purely as a monetary kind of contractual arrangement. There are a lot of problems on both sides of that equation. A lot of problems. I don't know.
Yeah, and again, what is the role of the missionary? Are we comparing what the role of that national or native missionary is in comparison to the North American?
Right.
I mean, when we're particularly sending North Americans to a given location, we're talking about sending them where there is no church. There
Right.
are no believers.
Right.
There
Right.
is no native or national to share the gospel in that city. So you have to send somebody from the outside, and in our case, primarily a Westerner. But I don't think we really should be in competition to start with. I agree with you.
Yeah.
And we've been doing some go-together teams where we're taking, particularly in this case, Brazilians and North Americans and blending them together for the same purpose of sharing the gospel.
I like what you said. It's an oversimplification of really a complex issue. There's too many different scenarios. Each field is unique. It's going to require different circumstances. I love what you said. You know, they're unreached. They're called unreached for a reason.
Yeah.
There are no nearby, in many cases, believers that you can lean on. Or how about this case? Sometimes the local nearby believers are the worst people that you would send in as missionaries because of the ethnic infighting and the strife. Talk about that.
Wow, that's a big one, because it just seems right that the people group right next door to this people group the Sawi would be a good case in point. Man, they reach the people groups, and they are reaching the people groups next to them, but that doesn't always translate.
That's right.
As David said. Well, what part of the world are we talking about? What part of this country that you're in are we talking about? What sort of people groups are we talking about around? What is their history together? Maybe actually the opposite will be true. I know a church that has went from we want to send people from our own body, church's agency, move to, well, we're not very good at this. It was a very large church, very capable church, to, well, we're going to work with partners, and we're going to define partners and organizations, and we're going to do that, who have now moved to, we're not going to do that. That's probably not really cost effective we are going to pour into the next door people group who will then reach the unreached. And that's their strategy for reaching unreached peoples. No, we're not going to send anybody there. We're not going to be doing that. We're going to pour into the next door people. But if you're going that route, it sounds good, but it has a lot of assumptions around it.
Right.
A lot of assumptions.
I mean, I was part of a ministry that was involved in media. So the flip side is we had 70-some Bible teachers, all native to the country in which they were teaching the Bible. Now, if you were trying to come to your question, definitely they could do way better than a Westerner if you sent a Westerner to try to do the same thing, but I wouldn't have classified those people necessarily as native missionaries. They were teaching the Word of God in their part of the world as maybe a pastor might or as an evangelist might. So again, we kind of get back to that discussion. So what do you really mean by native missionary?
Good point.
And who is the people that they're going to? Is it their own people that they're reaching out to? Are they more evangelists, or what are they really?
I'd point to one simple illustration in my mind in the Bible, and that would be Jonah. Jonah, next door people group, so to speak, to the Ninevites.
Right. Yeah.
Did he want to go?
No.
You hated him.
Oh my gosh, right?
Yeah.
So there's this automatic, no, that's going to be a natural thing. It's going to happen. And that's an unhealthy assumption, because in some cases it might be a very natural thing, in others not. Also, it comes along with that is the assumption that anybody coming from somewhere else in the world, as you said, maybe being a part of a multi-ethnic, multinational team of some kind, would not be as effective or is unwanted. And I would say a lot of this has roots in the Americans aren't needed.
Yeah.
They're not wanted. They cost too much.
Yeah.
They're ineffective relatively. And I would say, once again, broad brush stroke, oversimplification. And along with that, it depends upon the context.
I really like that. I think some of the things I've heard about this that concern me are the absolutes.
Yes.
This is the way it needs to be done.
Right.
It's the silver bullet. We figured it out. And I think the answer, and you've hit on it already, is every situation's unique.
Yeah.
So when God leads you to be his channel of blessing somewhere where there's no church, investigate, survey. Are there nearby reach people who could work? Oh, yes. Or no, there are no nearby reach people. What does it look like? And so the one size fits all is the thing that really it grates against me, because it's just not that way when you get out in the real world. And that's why I love your approach. As mission agency meant, it's both and, right?
Absolutely.
Well, the other thing is, we think of if we're going to look at it just as a monetary transaction, we're creating in some senses, and I would contend that where this model is now been embraced and taken in, that great dependency and lack of accountability, which is what we talk about with our missionaries in our churches, like, hey, you holding them accountable? Hey,
Right,
you know,
right.
it's like, well, how are you going to do that with nationals and indigenous people, and you're going to be able to stay on top of all of that? You know, you mentioned $100 a week, or
a month.
you meant a month.
Yeah.
But I mean, in some areas in the world, $100 a month, that's living large.
Yes.
Right.
And so how do you weigh the motives?
Yes.
How do you weigh how you're going to? You know, we had a church recently who, you know, decided they're going to go and they're going to invest in certain ways, and they're not going to use any organization or agency to help vet them. And the pastor came to our president a few months back and said, "Boy, what a major mistake it was."
Yeah.
We basically flushed $50,000 to $75,000 down a hole that everything that we were told it was going to be and what it turned out to be, it wasn't. And the reality is that we realized we didn't know what we didn't know. And we regret it. And now we're really going to move towards working with trusted partners who know something enough or can help us discover the process we need to take.
I think there's also the reality that if you're talking about this $100 a month, that's comparing salary to salary on the table. If we're talking about money that's being raised in the West in order to support a native missionary, how much does that cost? And that's hardly ever talked about when you read the articles or engage in this type of discussion, but it needs to be. Because when you talk about a mission agency and a North American missionary, their whole support schedule that people talk about is everything. I mean, they're raising the funds to run the mission agency, but then we flip the coin and talk about this native missionary, and we just talk about his $100 a month salary and start trying to compare the two.
But there's vast amounts of money that are spent on fundraising for those people when they're working domestically in the U.S., those organizations, right?
You don't get that by doing nothing.
Right. I'm going to share just a story. A friend of mine was a pioneer church planter in the Philippines, and God granted him favor. He had great success, raised up indigenous workers right away.
Yep.
You know, again, I want to emphasize that. We're not talking about foreign missionaries lingering too long.
Right.
His aim was to raise up Filipino nationals to do the work.
Great.
It's been a reproducing church. It's been really exciting. Well, he had a contemporary in field missionary also who did not have the same experience. He went out, he planted a church, but when he left the field, he had his financial partner support the Filipino pastor indefinitely.
Gotcha. Okay.
Wow.
And the fellowship, the koinonia in that congregation began to erode. And my friend was called on to observe the situation because he had planted a church that was now reproducing nationals, indigenous, and he came in and he looked at it and he investigated and he found out that that was the core issue. So these Filipino believers were not funding their pastor to be their pastor. That was being paid by Uncle Sam, someone else.
Right.
So we're not sharing in the kingdom together. Someone else is writing his check, and there was an erosion of fellowship because they weren't participating together in the purposes of God. Imagine how strange it would be if our pastors in the United States were receiving their salaries from foreigners. It would be quite odd. But let's talk about this. With that story in mind,
Okay.
there is a place
Yes.
to direct support to fledgling churches,
Yes.
indigenous believers. How do you do that in a way that doesn't create the spiritual dependency that we've been talking about?
Well, we're using a 5-year phase-out model in which basically every year that person who has gone there, that national who has gone to plant a church in that given location or in that given country, is receiving 20% less every year. And when he signs on, he knows that's the game plan. Okay? So our attitude is that hopefully you're planting a church. Hopefully that church is taking the responsibility to pay you as a pastor, if that's what they choose to do, to have a paid pastor. If at the end of that 5 years, the church is not capable of paying him full-time, that means he's got to go get a part-time job of some form or a full-time job and still pastor the church as a lay person. But at least it allows us to get away from this forever dependency. And when they sign on, they know that's the game plan. Now, I can tell you in one particular country of the world where we've had two churches or two pastors planting churches almost at the same time. One has done really well at phasing out 20%, and the church giving is meeting that difference. The other church is not doing nearly as well. Part of it has to do with the leadership, but part of it has to do with the people in the pews. They economically are not capable of giving enough to even replace, quote, $100 a month, if that were the case, to sustain the pastor. So in his case, he's going to get a job. But we at least helped him have 5 years to try to get a church planted. He got a church planted, and that's what our goal was. It wasn't to pay a pastor for life.
Yeah, I would say especially for churches, this is important. Educate yourself. I would say before you automatically, I love this about Americans often. This is such a great thing. We see the opportunity and they ask us to do something for them, and our hearts are, yeah, let's go do that. And we'll give them the $80,000 to do that, or the $5,000, or whatever it is. Right. I would suggest educate yourself. Read When Helping Hurts. Yeah. Read even great. Read The White Man's Burden. Understand that what you might be interpreting, which is a small amount to you, if you were asked to give, maybe let's just say, oh, $1,000 of mine does this. Wow. Oh, I'll at least do that. What that will really mean within that culture and to that people and what the expectations are, that might, I've often left in areas where I've left every dollar out of my pocket and most of my clothes and everything with me. Now there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing, right? Sure. But I can tell you for a fact, looking back several years later, that some of those actions in my well-meaning generosity have actually created the beginning of a dependency and an expectation that something will be there. So listen to some of the things that Steve Zane has talked about with the, I mean, there are lots of ways to educate yourself about this, and I would encourage churches as well, before they simply lay it out there, is to ask a ton of questions. Ask what is really expected here. And I would really encourage people as well to look at it and say, how will this giving of this project or whatever it is advance the Church of Jesus Christ in that community, as opposed to just doing it, you know?
I'm going to go back to that original question. What I'm surprised is no one has brought up is, so what if we decide to not send North American missionaries anymore and only give our wealth, which we have a lot of it, to the support of nationals around the world in some form, or native missionaries, whatever term you want to use? What is that going to do to the North American church if no one from this country, I mean, we're stagnant the way it is. If you look at the number of missionaries, North American missionaries going out, it is as flat as can be. So we obviously are not in a big growth pattern to start with. But what if we decide that no longer those 60,000 or whatever number you use of North Americans who serve the kingdom to try to share the gospel of Jesus Christ go anymore? What's going to happen?
It's a great point. I hadn't really thought about it, but so many times in Scripture we see God calling us towards suffering and sacrifice for the sake of the gospel, not away from it. And our sinful nature wants to run away from danger, run away from difficulty. In our consumer, comfort-driven culture, that's what we do. And yet God is saying, you want joy and peace and comfort and contentment? Actually move towards it for the sake of the gospel. And so the support native missionaries don't come really becomes an out for us that validates our self-serving mentality. And I hadn't really thought about that, but the implications could be catastrophic.
Well, and it really it's another way that churches can do missions by proxy. We write a check. We just write the check. we just did our missions thing. We're done.
Yeah.
We're doing missions.
That's right.
And I think it's really the lowest common denominator of mission. One other thing I'd like to throw in here that I think is important. I think when we look at many of the orgs and groups, and I'm not trying to criticize, I won't say anything by name, but dear well-meaning brothers and sisters that are really doing this emphasis of ministry, many of them are not doing missions work. We on this side think that the giving to that organization is, the gospel is going, but it's really discipleship and evangelism within their own people group, within their own area of country.
That's right. I think we don't find in Scripture, send someone else in your place.
No.
I mean, it's not there.
No.
And I've heard the argument against that is, what's it going to take to reach the lost? You know, you're asking the wrong question. What's the best way, most efficient way, cheapest way to reach the lost? And I think we've already addressed that, but I'll put it out there one more time. We'll end with that. So we're not called to send someone else in our place. The counter argument is, it's not about us, it's about the lost. This is the best way to reach the lost.
Well, it's definitely doing it together.
Yeah.
And that's why God is raising up today. I mean, in our case, we have over 100 years of missionary activity in Latin America. And what do you see today? You see God raising up missionaries out of Latin America to go to other parts of the world. Brazilians are going everywhere, if I can use that term. The Koreans have gone everywhere.
That's right.
And that's the beauty of seeing what God has done with his people and saying, hey, come follow me, and I will send you there.
I agree. I think that it's an old phrase now, the whole church to the whole world.
Absolutely.
It's happened.
Yes.
It's already happened.
Right.
It's not just happening. It's been going on for a while now, and God is kind of, I think, fueling that. And I think it's exciting to see that. I'm glad that people are embracing it. I think that we're seeing agencies even do that together. I agree with you. South Americans that are in Indonesia and other nations that are like, they fit well, it works. And once again, should we send our own? Absolutely we should. In fact, in many places where I have thought Americans aren't wanted here, I find Americans are invited with open arms. So it depends. Do your research well.
That's right.
Ask the questions. I think you'll find that it'll be great to be able to even partner with healthy and maturing indigenous workers. Can be a great experience. It can also be the worst experience. So ask those questions, walk with that. There's no guarantees, but empower people soon and quickly. Make it a both and.
We have only one Christ, and we are brothers on the same mission.
Yep, that's right. So just to distill this, it's not either or, it's both and.
Yes.
And your strategy should be determined by your research, prayer, exploration, looking at the circumstances in any given field or people group and saying, God, how can we bring your gospel to bear in this culture? Might be a combination of native workers and Western missionaries, but the one size fits all, it's not going to work.
Yep.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, man.
Continue the conversation at missiontable.org. The Mission Table is brought to you by 1615 Church Missions Coaching.